Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to our annual Mencken Day celebration honoring the memory, career, and bequest of Henry Louis Mencken as we approach what would be his 143rd birthday on September 12th. My name is Eben Dennis, and I'm the Special Collections Department Manager here at Enoch Pratt Free Library, the State Library Resource Center, where we take great pride and responsibility in the stewardship of the collection H.L. Mencken entrusted to us. For those of you that weren't here for this morning, before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the huge loss of our friend and colleague, Vincent Fitzpatrick, who passed away on July 15th. As many of you know, Vince was a leading expert and biographer of H.L. Mencken, and he worked with and curated the collection here at Enoch Pratt for over 40 years. So for over 40 years, Vince shared his love, his knowledge of H.L. Mencken with thousands of visitors. And he did this with warmth, humor, intelligence, and humility. Though his absence is felt today, he remains very present in spirit, as he was such a vital and central part of the Mencken community and today's celebration. So our hearts go out to his wife, Carol, and son, Michael, and his family, and all those in the Baltimore community and beyond that knew Vince, and we're lucky enough to spend an afternoon chatting with him. If you visit the Mencken Room today, you'll see an exhibit that he was working on entitled Ventures into Verse, that Paul Chasen helped put together with the help of Vince's wife, Carol. So please take a chance to go down there and look at it if you have the chance. Learn about a lesser-known side of H.L. Mencken, Mencken the poet. Moving on to today. Like H.L. Mencken, today's speaker is also an internationally known Baltimore-born journalist. And like Mencken, his collection, as of a couple years ago, is also part of the permanent repository here at Enoch Pratt Free Library. DeWayne Wickham is an old-school journalist who grew up here in Sandtown, Winchester, and Cherry Hill before beginning his career as an intern at the Baltimore Evening Sun. During a career that spanned over 50 years, he also worked as a copy editing intern for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, a Capitol Hill correspondent for the U.S. News and World Report, and a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. He hosted public affairs program for WBAL-TV, was a commentator for CBS, a Washington correspondent for Black Enterprise magazine, and a news show panelist for Black Entertainment Television. For 30 years, from 1985 to 2015, Mr. Wickham was a columnist for USA Today and the Gannett News Service. And in this role, his column was syndicated to more than 130 daily newspapers from Guam to Vermont. During his journalism career, he's flown on Air Force One as a special guest of President Barack Obama, crisscrossed the United States with Nelson Mandela on his first trip to the United States after being released from prison in South Africa. He was on the State Department plane that returned ousted Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide to Port-au-Prince following U.S. military intervention. And he had an 8-hour dinner meeting with the Cuban President Fidel Castro. Mr. Wickham has made more than 35 reporting trips to Cuba since 1999 and written over 100 columns about Cuba and its people. A founding member and former president of the National Association of Black Journalists, he was inducted into the group's Hall of Fame in 2015. In 2012, he was honored as a fellow of the Society of Professional Journalists, their highest honor. That same year, he was asked by Morgan State University to take on the job of creating a journalism school. So in 2013, Morgan School of Global Journalism and Communication opened with Mr. Wickham as its founding dean, and this was a position he held until his retirement in 2021. Before Morgan, Mr. Wickham served as interim chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at North Carolina A&T, and was a distinguished professor at both Delaware State University and the University of Pennsylvania. He's written articles for Crisis Magazine, The Root, The Undefeated, Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy, just to name a few. He's also the author of 3 books, Woodholm, A Black Man's Story of Growing Up Alone, Fire at Will, and Bill Clinton and Black America. Additionally, he edited Thinking Black, some of the nation's best Black columnists speak their mind. All these books you can find here at Enoch Pratt Free Library, your closest public library, or anywhere. Though he spends most of his time in sunny Florida these days, he's Baltimore's very own Mr. DeWayne Wickham. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. I came with a video that I want to share with you, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things first, because it was not my intention when I decided to accept the invitation to come here today to address the issue of Mencken's racism, alleged racism. I wanted to avoid the question because I thought the question, quite frankly, was a settled matter. And to that degree, I want to show you a video that will help you understand why I thought this was a settled matter. You're going to see a short clip from a C-SPAN broadcast on January 19th, 1990.
Black people was curious and total of total egalitarianism on the one hand, patronizing superiority on the other. You say that things just didn't make sense. You had people that worked for him and tremendous and kind. That's right. What did you conclude? Tell us more about that. Mencken published black writers in the American Mercury at a time when there were very few markets for the work of black writers. He encouraged his publisher, Alfred Knopf, to bring out the books. He played a very important part, an inspirational part, in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. He knew it was on friendly terms with and corresponded with many important books. Who were his closest friends? Writers, journalists, and musicians, and doctors. His attitude toward black people was curious and total egalitarianism on the one hand, patronizing superiority on the other. You say that things just didn't make sense. He had people that worked for him and tremendous and kind. That's right. What did you conclude? Tell us more about that. Mencken published black writers in the American Mercury at a time when there were very few markets for the work of black writers. He encouraged his publisher, Alfred Knopf, to bring out the books. He played a very important part, an inspirational part, in the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. He knew it was on friendly terms with and corresponded with many important black people at that period. And he and his brother had seen black women who cook and clean for them. And obviously he was very fond of them, took the most complete care of them. And he paid for medical bills if they got sick. Here we have what I call the egalitarianism. But at the same time, there's no question that he thought that black people were inferior to white. And speaking of these two black men who worked for him, he speaks of their belonging to the Afro-American race and very many of its psychological stigmata.
Okay, someone noticed that it repeated. Yeah, technology. I was trying to move something and hit the wrong button, so I apologize. But hopefully you got the point. That was Mencken's biographer, who the Pratt Library gave the go-ahead to publish the diary. The diary that was published contained only about a third of what Mencken had in his diary. It was a secret diary, which is to say, he, like many people who have diaries, didn't want it to get out, in this case, until 25 years after his death. And so the contents were revealed in the 1980s, 25 years after his passing in 1956, I believe the year was. The job of the journalist, I've told many of my students, is to seek truth and to report it. But to do this, journalists must do more than reporting. They must do a lot of reporting, a lot of research, and as much as possible, they have to try to avoid repeating. In journalism today, there's too much repeating and not enough reporting. I'm going to attempt in my presentation to share with you some of my findings about H.L. Mencken as relates to much of what has been said about him in the prior years, some of which has been said by some of my friends who stood here where I'm standing today and given the Mencken Day address. People who have been maybe a little shy or a little reluctant or maybe even a little confused as they try to analyze this great journalist and come to some understanding of what it is he stood for as it relates to race and his relationship with people of the African descent. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and my introduction to literature. I should preface it by saying that when Les Payne, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, gave his Mencken Day address in 1998, he started his remarks by pointing out that he and I had had a conversation. And in that conversation, I questioned, why are you giving the Mencken address? Wasn't he a racist? To which Les said, if you don't read racist, you probably will read very little American literature. Well, I read a lot of American literature. I was introduced to American literature at the Pennsylvania Avenue branch of the Enoch Pratt Library. As a third grader in 1953, I went there daily to sit at the feet of librarians who would read to us about distant places, people, and events, and I found it fascinating. I sat there. I lived just a couple of blocks away on Retreat Street. If any of you are familiar with West Baltimore, Retreat Street is a block or so above the intersection of North and Pennsylvania. And I lived on Retreat Street for a while, and then a block or so away on Francis Street. So I didn't live far from the library, and I didn't travel far in those days, a couple blocks. But when I sat at the feet of those librarians who would read to us, I traveled the world. I got to hear about distant places. I was fascinated by all that they shared with me. And it was through those sessions that I developed my love for storytelling, which is the taproot of journalism. But it wasn't until years later, after I launched my career in journalism and my friendship with Les Payne, that I came to know H.L. Mencken as more than just a name atop a newspaper column or a magazine article. But before I introduce you to how I found out about Mencken, how I discovered Mencken, I want to tell you something about myself, which may help you come to some understanding of what brings me to this conversation today. I was born in July of 1946 at Provident Hospital, which was then on Division Street. It was a couple of blocks away from Pennsylvania Avenue. My mother had labor pains on the morning of July 22nd, 1946, and I was born that afternoon at 4:30 p.m. She took me home to a small house on McKean Avenue, an area that is a part of the Sandtown Winchester community. And as you know, that community came to get worldwide media attention after the death of Freddie Gray. As a crow flies, McKean Avenue is less than 2 miles from Holland Street. That's where Mencken lived most of his life. But the years between Mencken's birth in September of 1880 and my birth in July of 1946, the years, and it's a lot of years between 1880 and 1946, it's exceeded by the distance between the lives of blacks and whites in Baltimore during that time because that was defined by power and privilege. I'll give you a couple examples. In 1899, Democrats in Baltimore mounted an aggressive campaign to unseat the mayor, the Republican mayor of Baltimore. Their complaint, he was too close to blacks. At a mass rally of the Democratic Party activists in April of that year, they drew thousands of people to the music hall on Mount Royal Avenue. It was quite a scene, according to a report in the Baltimore Sun. There were marching bands, a lot of high-stepping flag wavers, and an endless procession of people with banners, big banners. One of them was emblazoned with the words, "This is a white man's city." When people saw this banner, the Baltimore Sun reported on April 6th of that year, it was the cause for the wildest show of enthusiasm that the Democrats received that day. On election day that year, the Democratic challenger easily defeated the incumbent mayor, causing the New York Times to report that the race question entered into the election. The feeling against the Negro was very strong. The streets downtown, the reporter wrote, are crowded tonight, but the colored man is conspicuously absent. 11 years later, in 1910, Baltimore became the first city in the nation to enact a law that made it illegal for Black people to move into a neighborhood in which 51% of the population was white. Neighborhoods like the block on Holland Street where Mencken lived. And then in April of 1942, in what may have very well been this nation's first Black Lives Matter demonstration, more than 2,000 people marched on the governor's office in Annapolis to protest police violence. See if this has a familiar ring. Police violence against Blacks in Baltimore. Violence in which 10 Black men had been killed by police in the short span of 4 years. And then finally, on June 7th, 1946, a little more than a month before I was born, the Sporting News reported that a riot broke out at Baltimore's minor league baseball stadium after a white mob charged the field in search of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson at the time was playing with the Montreal Royals, a minor league team of the Brooklyn Dodgers. He'd been sent there to, get used to playing with white players in stadiums with white fans, but strategically, the Dodgers chose to send him to Montreal because all of the teams Montreal competed with, except Baltimore, were above the Mason-Dixon line. And they thought there'd be not so much trouble. But in Baltimore, there was trouble. He was chased from the field. He was protected by 3 white players who stayed in the visitors' locker room with him for hours until the mob went away. That's the Baltimore I was born into. And it is the city that Mencken grew up in. And I suspect that both of our lives and both of our views on race were shaped by these and many other events like them in Baltimore, a city that Johns Hopkins University historian I was trying to think of his last name now. His last name is Keiko. Called the Baltimore, he called the northernmost outpost of the Jim Crow South. So, how was I introduced to Mencken? The introduction came in 1993, years after Mencken had passed away, even after the diary was released. I was interviewing people for my autobiographical book. Wrote about 10 years of my life. And I went to interview a lady by the name of Essie Hughes. And Miss Hughes had been vice principal at Douglas High School during the time that I was there. And she had played an important role in getting me admitted to Douglas after I had been kicked out of 3 other high schools in the city. City College, Carver High School, and Edmondson. And so Essie Hughes played a very important role in helping me to gain admission into Douglas. So I was there to interview her about that, to get that background so I could tell my story of those 10 troubled years. And somehow in the course of the conversation, she started talking to me about her time at Douglas. She had been a student at Douglas in the 1920s. And while she was a student at Douglas, she joined the school's debate team. She was on the second squad. On the first squad was a fellow by the name of Thurgood Marshall. And there came a time when her instructor, a fellow by the name of Goff McDaniels, he was a World War I veteran, and he had been disfigured and voice altered a bit by a nerve gas attack during the war. But he was the homeroom teacher, and he was also the teacher who headed the debate team. And so McDaniels came to class one day waving high an article that had been written by H.L. Mencken. And he turned to Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall by that time was probably 6'1", 6'2". I think eventually he went to 6'3". And Essie Hughes never got past 4'10". And he said to Thurgood, you got to take this and you got to go over to Holland Street and you got to challenge Mencken on this. Well, Thurgood Marshall didn't go, but Essie Hughes did. And she went and she took along with her another female member of the debate team, maybe a little taller. And they walked 20 blocks or so to Holland Street, knocked on the door. Mencken answered, and they proceeded to give him what for about what he said about the dearth of Black leadership in the city. He listened patiently, and then he thanked them for coming and said he appreciated that they had the nerve to come over and raise those issues with him. What Mrs. Hughes didn't say during my interview with her, and probably didn't even know at the time, certainly not at the time that she made the long walk, she may have discovered it later, was the reason why Mencken had caused such great anger with her teacher. Goff McDaniels was one of Baltimore's Black leaders. He was a leader in the Baltimore branch of the NAACP. He was a labor activist. He was an anti-lynching activist. And he was president of the city's alumni chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha, the nation's oldest Black fraternity. But from his observation post on Holland Street, Mencken apparently knew nothing of this local Black leader or others like McDaniels. So what is a journalist who is committed to doing more reporting and less repeating to do with all of this? Many of Mencken's supporters, both Black and white, argue that he should be judged by the good things he did for Black folks, people he often called his darker brothers. They cite his 1935 testimony before a Senate committee in support of an anti-lynching bill as proof that he was not a racist. But good reporting requires that a journalist compare that short testimony. I actually got a copy of it and read it, to something he wrote about a lynching that took place in Salisbury in 1931. His testimony in 1935, he gets a lot of credit for, though I suspect most people didn't read it. In the congressional record, it took up maybe half a page. It's very short. But he wrote a blistering column after the lynching of Matthew Williams in Salisbury on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1931. He was really upset about that. Now, let me tell you something about the lynching. His name, again, I want to say, is Matthew Williams. I want to repeat the name because in Mencken's column, he never even mentioned his full name. But he was very upset about what had happened. Williams was suspected of killing someone he worked for, a white man that he worked for, although a lot of testimony came out later that it was probably the man's son. But notwithstanding that, the charge was that Williams did it, and Williams was assaulted, beaten badly. He lost most of his sight and was hospitalized. And while being hospitalized and protected as best he could by a sheriff and a single deputy, they were overtaken, those law enforcement officers, by a mob which dragged Williams from the hospital, tied him to the back of a car and drove him through town with his body on the ground, twisting. And then they strung him up on a courthouse yard, in the courthouse yard, to a tree. And when they tied him to the tree, they released him and dropped him down. Then they pulled him back up again and dropped him down again. And pulled him up again, and they dropped him down again. They did it repeatedly. And I guess they were having fun at that point, so they decided, well, why stop now? So they took him down and dragged him into the black section of Salisbury, where they once again hung him from a tree. And this time they got about 40 gallons of oil, gas, threw it on him, and they ignited his body. And they stayed, it was reported, until the flames were completely out, whereupon they cut off his fingers and his toes, and according to a report in the Afro-American newspaper, went down the street throwing them on the porches of the black residents who lived there. There was a lot for Mencken to be upset about, a lot. In his column in the Baltimore Evening Sun that appeared 4 days after Matthew Williams, let me repeat his name again because Mencken didn't, was dragged behind the car, Menckens blamed the lynching on what he called the ninth-rate men who were running things on the Eastern Shore. That's who he was upset with, these ninth-rate men. These men, Mencken said, were a very low grade of politician whose leadership had caused the entire state of Maryland to spiral down. And then Mencken said this about the white leadership of that small Maryland town, which seemed to sum up, for me at least, the reason for his outrage. What they permitted to happen, he said, holds all of us up to contempt of the nation and the world by staging a public obscenity worthy of cannibals. It just brought down the reputation of the state of Maryland. And Mencken made it clear that that infuriated him. So was Mencken moved to testify in support of the federal anti-lynching bill because he was outraged by the mob violence that took the life of Matthew Williams? Or was he moved to speak up because of the disgrace that lynching heaped upon the state? Some who argue that H.L. Mencken was not a racist also point to the 10 years, and you saw some of that in the film there, that he spent as editor of the American Mercury. He was editor of the American Mercury from 1924 until 1933, which almost spanned the entirety of the time when the American Mercury was really thought of to be a great publication. My friend Les Payne, in his presentation, kind of walked gingerly past the assertion that Mencken was a racist by pointing out in his address that a fellow by the name of Charles Scruggs, author of a book called The Sage of Harlem, had given great credit to Mencken for creating the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance was that great Black intellectual, social, artistic, and coming out of the Black community that occurred during the 1920s and into the 1930s. And it's true that while Mencken was the magazine's editor, a long list of Blacks were published in the American Mercury. In fact, Mencken's magazine is widely credited with publishing more works of Black writers than all other major white-owned journals combined. That may be true too. But since there was no rush to publish Black writers, that may not be something to brag about. Of course, Mencken deserves credit for opening up the pages of the American Mercury to the Harlem Renaissance writers. But what the people who chronicle those times seem to have overlooked is that the crisis, the NAACP's monthly magazine, was by far the greatest publisher of Black writers during the Harlem Renaissance, not the American Mercury. Listen to this. Practically every Negro author writing today found his audience through the pages of the crisis, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in the 1925 annual report of the NAACP. And in his biography, Langston Hughes said that in the early years of the Harlem Renaissance, 3 Blacks, Jesse Fawcett at the Crisis, Charles Johnson at Opportunity, and Elaine Locke in Washington were the 3 people who midwifed the so-called new Negro literature into being. Fawcett has been lost to history, but she was the literary editor of the Crisis. Charles Johnson, who went on to be a college president, was the editor of Opportunity, the Urban League's publication. And it was a monthly publication. And Elaine Locke, for a time, was chair of the Department of Philosophy and at Howard University, and he was the literary mentor to several of the Harlem Renaissance most successful writers. During Fawcett's time at the Crisis, from 1919 to 1924, the monthly circulation of the NAACP's publication was as much as 100,000 copies. In 1924, Fawcett's last year as literary editor, the average monthly paid circulation of the Crisis dropped to 35,000 copies. Under Mencken's editorship, the American Mercury sold 15,000 copies in its first issue in January of 1924. The magazine's monthly sale peaked at 84,000 copies early in 1928 And by the time Mencken resigned in 1933, its circulation had dropped sharply. Comparable circulation, but the crisis, and to a lesser extent opportunity of publication, gave significant opportunities for Black writers to publish their work. And in fact, if you just chart it out in terms of the years, 1919 to 1924, it was just the crisis. Just a crisis, because the American Mercury didn't start publishing until 24. That was opening up all these opportunities for Harlem Renaissance writers. Yes, Mencken played an important role in exposing Harlem Renaissance writers to white readers. But it was people like Fawcett, Johnson, and Locke, people who have largely been lost to history, who played the pivotal role in giving voice to the Black writers of that movement. Now, when portions of Mencken's secret diary were published in 1989, his use of racial slurs to describe Blacks, words like shine, blackamoors, smoke, and yes, nigger, left many of his supporters scrambling to try to figure out, how do we put a good face on this? How do we make this acceptable? In an October 1927 editorial in the American Mercury, Mencken wrote about how a good bit of Black culture was becoming the nation's dominant culture. His supporters contend that this editorial is an example of how Mencken spoke admiringly of the achievements of Blacks. But for others, the opening sentence of the editorial caused them to question whether what follows was just faint praise. In that sentence, Mencken asked if the nation was transitioning from an age of boring white culture to one that is dominated by the lifestyle of coons. And if this column was actually meant to be a compliment to Blacks, why did he refer to them as coons? In another excerpt from Mencken's diary, he wrote disparagingly about Black women as he tried to explain how the fall his Black maid took on a heavily waxed floor was her fault. He's writing in his diary now. He didn't want anybody to see it for 25 years. And what does he say? He said saying he had warned her about putting too much wax on the floor. Mencken explained why his warning went unheeded. It is impossible to talk anything resembling discretion or judgment into a colored woman. Now, by the way, one of my predecessors here at this podium used this quote, but did not use the next sentence. Because the next sentence reads, they are essentially childlike, and even hard experiences does nothing to teach them anything. They went from talking about a woman to Black women. And that was his finding. So said the sage of Harlem. And finally, there is this. In a 1926 review of the New Negro, the groundbreaking book that was edited by Alain Locke, a book that many people believe marked the literary pinnacle of the Harlem Renaissance, Mencken said that publication possibly marked the American Negro's final emancipation from his inferiority complex. But then he backtracked. by adding that he thought that there were some serious difficulties that stood in the way of Blacks achieving this goal. Quote, "The vast majority of people of their races," he wrote, "are but 2 or 3 inches removed from gorillas." I need to read that again. He was explaining why, even though he thought the new Negro, the writers, what they had to say offered great promise, that Blacks had gotten over their sense of inferiority. He said, but there's a big problem here, because the vast majority of the people of their race are but 2 or 3 inches removed from gorillas. He wasn't finished. "It will be a sheer impossibility for a long, long while to interest them in anything above pork chops and bootleg gin." So, was H.L. Mencken a racist? I'll leave it to you to decide. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, microphones are on.
I do encourage you to read Mencken.
Would you not consider Mencken to be more elitist, because he did not restrict comments like the comments? He didn't restrict comments to just race. He didn't like ignorance. If he spoke as harshly on the vast majority of all humans on the earth. And if you want to choose quotes, you could find pretty much anything to support that he didn't like anybody.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you think that he's more of an elitist and a racist, or do you disregard the fact that he's an elitist at all?
No, I think H.L. Mencken was a fascinating man, and in many ways, he was an island unto himself. He didn't like pretty much anybody. But I do think that he thought of the entire human race as undeserving of life. I mean, he kind of viewed himself as, he viewed himself and a very small group of people that came to win his acceptance as a class unto themselves, and so everyone else was. Yeah, but I think that to your point, he grouped pretty much all Blacks in that category.
Well, could he have, in say grouping all Blacks, then would he want to publish them? My point is that I think he's elitist, and he wanted to introduce people he respected to his circle, from what I've read.
So if you, this requires some more reporting, but if you go back and you do a bit more reporting, what you'll see, the Crisis started publishing under Fawcett's editorship in 1919, and in 1919 and 1924, those were the peak years of their circulation. And then along comes the Mercury in 1924. They were looking for an audience. And because Mencken was such an elitist, he didn't appeal to many white readers of that day. He struggled to get white readership. He struggled to get readership. And so it seems to me that it might have been a natural thing for him to try to find readership where he could in the Black community, to bring them on. And so, but even with that, he struggled, because even when he said, okay, I'll do this, or I'm going to write an article for the Crisis, I'm still going to rub their noses in the mud.
I'm trying to understand. So if he didn't respect the black audience,
Yeah.
he wanted them anyway? Like
Yes.
elitist?
Yes, because the publication was trying to make money, and they struggled and they went out of business. I mean, when he left the American Mercury in 1933, they were on one leg. The publication was doing poorly. In fact, Nathan, who had been his co-publisher, had moved on to another publication that was doing pretty good. So it doesn't, for my purposes, I don't see anything there that would suggest that he couldn't be both at one time. I don't like them. I don't think I don't want to say he didn't like. I don't think much of them.
But that was, I mean, intellectuals. We had Intellectual magazine.
Yes.
He thought they were not intellectual, but he targeted them, even though he felt that they were intellectual.
He targeted the talented tenth of the black community.
All right, I still don't understand.
W. Du Bois said in The Souls of Black Folk that the race would be saved by the talented tenth. So in many ways, Du Bois was an elitist, as was Mencken, in thinking in how he thought about the black race. They thought that there was only a top tier of the black race that they wanted to appeal to. And he wanted to use, and he knew, Mencken knew, as the other publications knew, that if you could get those people to write for you, you could reach a broader audience in the black community. And I think that's what he was striving to do. But listen, I don't think he liked anyone as a group. There was no one group that he liked. As in terms of racial identity, he liked people who he thought were the great intellectuals of the world. He just didn't think there were many black intellectuals.
Or anybody, actually.
Yeah.
The question that he has here kind of right here. It kind of helped frame the question that I had even before his question. But his question, which kind of turned into a dialogue, makes me curious as an African American. Why would we be questioning whether he's an elitist or a racist and having a day recognized by him in a society that if clearly an African American journalist or any other figure spoke of white people in the way that he spoke of black people, would it be even a question? So my question was for you to speak about the time of him being a journalist, and even the time that we're in now, that he's still recognized to have a day.
Yeah, so this is one of the things I think we're going to forever struggle with, because we live in a time where we have different judgments about race and racism. So what was acceptable then during the time of his life? I struggled to try to figure out what were the acceptable language barriers. You know, H.L. Mencken wrote a whole volume on language, and within that volume he had a whole piece on black names, or names of black people, and how they came into use. And in one of those chapters he talks about coons and how the word coons came into use. And he admits, he says in that section that this was a disparaging term. And so I read that, and then I say, well, if he says that, as he talks about how names have come into use, common usage, why does he use the term if he's not intent upon speaking disparagingly? But there is, listen, I think even among black journalists, I'm probably a minority viewpoint when I say he didn't do that much for black writers relative to what blacks did. And so if you only talk about H.L. Mencken from the perspective of the Sage of Harlem, Charles Scruggs's book about Mencken and all that he did for black writers, Nowhere in the Sage of Harlem does he talk about the crisis or opportunity or the other black publications that did the yeoman's work of publishing black writers. So if you lose that part, you know, you end up with just what Mencken did. But let's say, for purposes of argument, that Mencken didn't do any of that. He didn't publish a single black writer. Would we have thought, would the Harlem Renaissance have gotten as much notice? Probably not. Even though the black publications did more to publish the writers, there is something there was certainly then and probably is today, something in America that uplifts your work if it is accepted and acknowledged by whites. You win the Pulitzer Prize, it's a big deal. There's some black literary awards that are given every year. Most people don't even know their names. So I think that there was some benefit to it to that extent. But when you read the writings of Langston Hughes and others, contemporaries, they don't give him the credit that some today give him for helping the Harlem Renaissance along.
My recollection is correct. The last thing Mencken wrote was a piece in 1948, immigration and tennis courts.
Yeah.
Which was so segregated.
Yes.
And so I think he was sensitive to the minority groups as a whole.
Yeah.
I don't think it was insensitive. Just the prejudices that existed in society. He was no reformer. And neither was John Kennedy. Time, 3 years, dragged into that corner.
Yeah.
Civil rights movement. They had plenty of opportunity to participate.
So you're right. And the difficult thing with Mencken always is trying to figure out motivation. Mencken did not like government. At almost any level, he did not like government. He certainly didn't like government imposing its will upon individual behavior. But if you read that piece, and I'm sure you have, at the end of it, I think the last 2 or 3 paragraphs, he talks about golf, and wonders why any black would even go out to a golf course, because they probably don't have the means to pay the fees to play anyway. So it's always a little push and a pull with Mencken, but I think he didn't like government, and if you were being attacked some way, or he thought you were being abused in some way by the dictates of government, he would be your champion. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Yes.
I have a lot of voice. In regards to, I think it's pretty clear that he was bigoted even by the standards of his time in very connected ways. And I'm curious, do you think that despite that he had a sort of strange fascination, not strange, but like a fascination with black culture, or do you think it was just a commercial?
No, I think he was actually fascinated that some blacks rose above his perceptions of black people. I would put it that way.
Do you think that was it? It was an interest in black culture itself?
No, I saw no indication he was interested in black culture. He talked about black culture. He talked about black song, black dance, and all those things. But he was not someone who took advantage of those opportunities to get involved in that part of black culture. And he was just an observer. Yeah. But I think he was fascinated that he actually found some black people who rose above his perception or his beliefs of black people. He thought the vast majority of them were just 2 or 3 inches or whatever removed from being gorillas. But it was that didn't surprise him. That's what he thought most black people were. he was fascinated by the ones who he thought rose above that.
And do you think that there was a commercial element to all this, that you thought this was something you could exploit?
I think to some extent there was a commercial element, but I think also there was another piece to it, and that is that if he thought he had this great hatred for Southerners, for Southern whites.
But he wrote all these pieces that are very nostalgic for Southern culture at the same time. He writes these pieces where he's critical of Abraham Lincoln, that
Yeah.
was created after the Civil War, where it's sort of this wistfulness for the end of what the world would have been like.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. It's just very confusing. In 2023, it's very
I'm often very confused when I read Mencken myself. To try to, I'll read Mencken one day and I'll say, he wasn't a bad guy. And then I'll read him the next day and I go, wow, how could he say that? I just think that I'm trying to wrap this up in my own mind. And generally, I think that it is about class. Yeah, he could not hear the man in the back. Yeah, I think he is. He's very caught up in class. He's very much of an elitist. But I mean, he was a Baltimore Brahmin who didn't leave Holland Street very much, except to go up to New York from time to time to participate in the publication of the Mercury, but he didn't live there. I mean, he pretty much lived on Holland Street. And so I think he was a Baltimore Brahmin. He saw the world very narrowly in terms of his own beliefs about intelligence, and everyone else kind of fell into that category of the great unwashed.
Brahmins didn't live on Holland Street.
Now,
So,
he did.
right.
He-
But
he-
he was a striker, think
Yeah.
of it that way.
Yeah, he could have lived among them. And I hear a lot. People talk about how, well, he had black people living near him on Holland Street, and he did. He did. They lived in the alley behind him. He was not threatened by black people. I don't think that he was threatened pretty much by anyone other than maybe some of those folks on the Eastern Shore who talked about killing him when he was writing about the lynchings over there. And this, they banned the Sun for many, many years, boycotted the Sun. But if he had any fear, he may have been briefly of them. But I just think that he sat in Holland Street and he just came away thinking that he knew about the world, and he passed judgment on the world from that very narrow perspective that Portsea had in West Baltimore.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciated your invocation of less pain and the comment about American literature at the beginning. And I think that the publication of the diaries is what my students would today call cancel culture, an example of Mencken getting canceled. And since then, we've been engaged in this dialogue of redemption, which I think you've pointed out really well, that might not be very productive. So I'm just wondering if we let go of this redemption dialogue or this urge to make him acceptable, then what do we do? What's the middle ground? What does our dialogue about Mencken look like in that middle ground in between redeeming him and canceling him?
So listen, my perspective, I'm not here to argue, is not without its faults. What I'm here to argue is that the job of the journalist is to do more reporting than repeating. I don't accept the idea that the release of the diary is cancel culture. It's his diary. Those are his words. But I think that it is incumbent upon those of us who want to get to the bottom of the Mencken story to do more research, to explore. You know, the question was, well, did you think he was motivated by money? Yeah, I kind of think so, but I don't have enough evidence to support it yet. We need to, what do we know about all the publications, about the publication history of the American Mercury, and about revenue? And so until you do the work, it's hard to get past assumptions and maybe beliefs that are guided, that are formed largely by your own biases. So I think hopefully you can get your students to do that research.
I think we have time for probably one more question. Is anybody else?
DeWayne, I thought it was, I have a loud voice, but so everyone can hear.
The one we're
DeWayne, I thought it was so instructive the way you described the lynching and Mencken's reaction to it. And I don't know how much you delved into what he said and wrote about it, but of course, absent was the racial motivation. He spoke about it. What you shared is him speaking about it as sort of isolated, that it had to do with a handful of politicians in Maryland or something. No mention of it being in the context or of similar acts that happened all across the country or racial violence. It reminds me of somehow this sort of revisionism about race today, where an education secretary in Oklahoma could say that the racial murders in Tulsa were separate from race. It reminded me of that. And I think that's something we're dealing with as we are in an era where people who are using a concept like critical race theory, having no idea what it is or what it means, and sort of applying it in a way to sort of deracialize, I guess I'd say, to pull race out of an act of that you described, the way you described that lynching is shows a pure kind of evil and race and dehumanization that is at the heart of what racism is.
So I think that we should make note of the fact that H.L. Mencken did not actually opposed a federal lynching law prior to 1931. He spoke in opposition, wrote in opposition to federal lynching laws before there was that lynching in 1931 in Maryland, because he said he thought it brought down the image of the state. And so I think that it brought down the image of the state. So I think that we have to kind of dissect all of this. What does this mean? He didn't support anti-lynching legislation before there was a lynching in Maryland. We know that for sure. And we have to try to figure out, was he then motivated because he came face to face with the brutality of lynching? Or was he motivated because he thought it besmirched the name and reputation of his state? He spoke to the latter in his column, but he didn't speak to the former. So I don't know. I was struck by the fact that in his column, in the first column he wrote about the 1931 lynching, he didn't mention Matthew Williams until the end of the column, and then he only referred to him as Williams. Had no first name. And I just think, if you are really outraged by the brutality of what happened to this man, wouldn't you know his name? Wouldn't you speak his name? Say my name. Wouldn't you do that?
Talking about someone considered one of America's great thinkers, and you think you could have to place it into context. As you were speaking, I'm reminded, of course, of FDR's resistance to anti-race, anti-lynching legislation. Eleanor Roosevelt pushed for it, and they fought over it. She wanted it, but he remained resistant to that for political and other.
Yeah. And Mencken took him to task for that too, by the way. Mencken was upset that once he got on board, he couldn't get FDR on board. He was upset about that. Yeah.
Quickly add, just to make it explicit, I take your points. I'm not arguing with you at all.
Yes, sir.
But I don't think, and people in this room, or all of them may know more about Mencken than I do, but I just think it needs to be made explicit, however you interpret it, and you've given a context for it. But Mencken did go on record along with Dreiser as supporting, eventually supporting, an anti-lynching law. I just say it for the record, because I don't think you said it explicitly.
Yes, I did. In fact,
Oh, I may have missed it.
yeah, he testified before a congressional committee in 1935, and I spoke to that. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it was a big deal in the black press. Black newspapers all over the country wrote about the fact that H.L. Mencken went before Congress to speak in support of the lynching law that was there. By the way, you know, he always hedges his bet. And so while he spoke in support of it, in that same testimony, which was about half a page long, wasn't long, he also thought that it probably wouldn't pass. And if it did pass, it wouldn't pass constitutional muster. And he may have been right about that, because one of the things the law sought to do was to force the towns in which the lynchings took place to pay a financial penalty. Yeah. And so he said, I support this law, but I don't think that's going to fly. But wow, but you know, we'll go as far as we can with it, and then we'll see where we need to go from there.
I believe FDR never ceded to any kind of support for the anti-lynching efforts, because my understanding is he was trying to keep his southern base, southern support of the Dixie Fat Democrats.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Okay, we've gone a bit past 3 o'clock, so once again, I want to thank Mr. DeWayne Wickham for talking to us today. Could you give him another round of applause? And Mr. Hart, I think you all were going to have a meeting after this, so if anyone has any questions, if you want to go see the Mencken exhibit downstairs in the Mencken Room, please be our guest. We'll be out in the hallway for a little bit as well. Thanks.